Welcome to Insights in Sound, where we talk to the people behind the scenes, behind the technology, and behind the music. People you may not know, but you should. And please check out getitinwriting.net/shows for a full list of our podcast YouTube series.
Welcome to Insights in Sound, live from the NAMM Show. My special guest today is Mr. Erik Zobler. You were not necessarily inclined to be a live sound mixer. Tell us a little bit about how you ended up there.
Well, I started studying broadcasting, and some of my very first jobs were doing live theater stuff is the very first things that I ever did. And I learned very quickly that I wanted to be in the studio. I liked being in the studio, and so I focused on that.
Spontaneity aspect of it, or?
I just liked the control factor, and I liked the pace. And a little bit predictable, and I like the pace. You know, I like when it comes to reading. I'm not a fast reader. I like to enjoy reading. I feel the same way about being in the studio. I like to enjoy the process. So I've had a long career in the studio. I always did a little bit of live stuff. Every once in a while, I would be asked if I could come out and mix a show for somebody. And so I would do it one or two times a year for many, many years. Majority of my work was in the studio. And the job of a mixing engineer in the studio and live uses the same tools. The tools are basically the same, but they're used very differently in a lot of different situations. So around 2002 or so, before that, when I was working with George Duke, he had a live engineer that he would hire. He now works with Earth, Wind & Fire. Great guy, T.J. Jackson. He's a fantastic engineer and a wonderful human being. And I learned from him as well. When he would go out with George, I would not go out. You know, George is in the studio most of the time, and I would work with George Duke, and he'd go out on the road, and then I would do other stuff, do other projects, but I'd still be in the studio. There was a time when TJ couldn't make the gig. He was booked on something else, so George just said, "Come out, you know, you'll be fine." And I was like, "No." I'm like scratching, you know, pulling away. "No, don't take me." And he said, "No, you're great. You'll be fine." You know, he was always like that. You know.
Right. Well, and that's the sense that I always had about him, was that he really encouraged you and helped you to grow in that sense too. So
he did, not just me, everyone. He was like that with everyone. But yes, he did. And it was good. It was good for me to go out too, because even when I was doing other studio stuff that was not his stuff, I'd always come back with some fresh something, you know, that was different from what we did. So, you know, sure. it kind of in a way invigorated us a little bit too. But around 2000 or so was when I went out and I did my first bus tour. You know, up to that point, I never considered myself a live engineer. I was just somebody who was just filling in.
Occasional gig.
Yeah, I was just filling in. You know, somebody couldn't make a gig.
On the road, that's a completely different set of circumstances. It's a completely different culture.
Yeah, when someone tells you, you know, when you get on the bus and you go to sleep, put your feet towards the front of the bus. It's not something I ever even considered, but of course it makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely,
you know?
yeah.
The other one, and live people will laugh when I say this, but you don't poop on the bus. Only pee-pee.
It's so true. It's so true.
So,
you get very, very
things,
close with
I didn't, you know, I just didn't know these things, you know, and you learn by experience. So that was how I kind of transitioned into doing more front of house work.
Now let's talk a little bit about the technical aspects of it, because they're, as you say, it's the same tools, but there's a whole lot more preparation involved, for one thing. You've got to have not just a plan A and B and C, but you've got to have multiple fail-safe points, so to speak, right?
I would say yes and no. I mean, things are pretty bulletproof these days. So the adage, the show must go on, is absolutely true. And when you have a problem, you figure out how to work it out. But I don't have redundant systems for everything. the most important things, I will have a secondary mic for whoever the main singer is. You have a main mic and a backup mic, and if they're an instrument like a guitar or something, I might have a backup on that. Other than that, you check everything out during sound check and make sure everything is working, and then if nothing gets touched, you're okay to the show. If you have another band come on to do a sound check after you, then you've got to go and line check everything before your show again to make sure that nothing happened. Nothing got unplugged. Someone tripped over a cable, like Metallica.
Yeah. Well, now there's another aspect that I want to get a little bit into here too, though, because there's a human aspect to it. When you're touring and you're in that bubble, those relationships are everything. You have to have great relationships, not only with the artist, because the artist is trusting you the same way the artist trusts you in the studio, but you better have a really great relationship with your monitor engineer, pretty much everyone on the crew, because you're in that bubble with them, and you need to depend on each other in ways that in the studio it's not as critical.
No, it's not as critical because in the studio, because there's time. If something's wrong, you have time to fix stuff.
Right.
When you're doing a live performance, stuff has to work, and it has to work now. Mm-hmm. And relationships are very important. If I can digress a little bit about this, one of the things that I like coming out of the studio and being on the road is the fact that you get to hang out with the band and the crew too. And when you're in the studio, especially if you're a mixer, you maybe see the band a little bit, and the rest of the time you're there by yourself or with an assistant, maybe a producer.
Even if they're there.
What's that?
The dynamics are different even if they're there. I mean, even if you had the whole band in the studio at the same time.
And that has happened.
Dynamic then, yeah, exactly.
Many times.
We try to avoid it when we can. But the dynamic is different because everybody's kind of calm and laid back, as opposed to all wired because of the energy of the show.
Yeah, and you do get wired at the end of the show, but well, yeah, just from the you get jacked up from the performance. I mean, it takes me like a couple of hours to wind down. That's when you hit the green room and see what kind of alcohol is in there.
Mood adjustments, yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, that's post show. A little just and it's that's part of the gig that's very different from the studio, is that there's quite a bit more camaraderie, and you get to build those relationships. Rather than just being, even though it's work and it's after the show or before the show, you're in a hotel or you're traveling together. You get to know each other, and that's a nice part that doesn't really exist in this studio world very much. It does to some degree, but not like it is when you're stuck with people, in the airport for 6 hours or something,
And not just that, but you're in this situation for weeks or months or even longer, and you're going to typically foreign countries. These are your people. These are the people that you're surrounded by. Yes, there are there's crew du jour, and there are people at every venue and stuff like that. But for the most part, these are the people that you really start forming these bonds with.
Yes.
In a way that you just don't, even on an album project.
Well, yes, I would say yes and no. I mean, it depends how much time you spend with somebody. Like the artist, typically in the studio, you do tend to create a strong relationship, because you don't get any more vulnerable than being in the studio. Sure. You have a certain intimacy that happens in the studio.
Yeah.
And it's different on the road.
But I'm thinking, like, especially what you get in terms of those relationships with crew. And there are members of the crew that you really need to depend on a lot more in a live situation, day to day,
In particular, the monitor engineer and the front of house engineer in particular, I mean, because everybody's important. Backline, everybody involved is important. Tour manager. But the relationship between the front of house and monitor engineer can make everything go smoother if you understand each other's job and don't get in each other's way, and then support and help each other prepare for the show that's coming. And I have heard other crews from venues that we go to who compliment me and Denny Mack, who's a fantastic engineer on front of house and monitors. He does everything. He's fantastic, and people tell us that we work really well together. I mean, we just do what we're doing, so we're like, okay, great. I'm glad you like what we do, but it's always nice to hear that, and we do work well together for sure. And I love the guy, so that doesn't hurt.
Yeah, and also because the most important aspect of this is that you're gaining the trust of the artist. The artist is leaning on you to make sure that performance is happening, and if that trust isn't there, that he or she can rely on that relationship that you guys have.
I can tell you, I don't know that we mentioned Kenny Loggins before,
right.
And that's because that's who I've been out with, the last 4 or 5 years. The COVID has kind of put a giant question mark in the middle of my sense of time.
Yeah.
But I have found that over time that I could tell that Kenny was trusting me more and more. He would like get on the mic and say, "Erik, how does this sound?" And I, based on my response, we would either fix something or move on. And most of the time we just move on because, we have a lot of stuff to do usually. Yeah. And if it ain't broke, right. We don't fix it.
Right. Yeah.
So we do. I mean, I have felt his trust grow over time, which is nice. It's great.
Yeah. So let's get into some of the technical specifics of, what those differences are. I mean, as you say, it's mostly the same gear, maybe different microphone choices, obviously, but for the most part, you're doing the same gig, but you're doing the same gig completely differently.
Yeah, let's. There's a lot of places we could go with that.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, microphone thing, you could start there. A lot of people like to start there. One of the things that we do is that we try to not pick very esoteric microphones because we backline everything, and everywhere we go we have to rent stuff. So we use more generic stuff because we know it's going to be there. And
everyone's got a 57.
Everyone's got a 57. Yeah. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's one of the greatest mics, if not the greatest mic ever made.
Versatility.
It works on everything.
Yep.
But so that's one thing, and it becomes very subjective mic selection. The main thing is you just want to be aware of cardioid, omni, and how much stage leakage you're going to get. More of a situation that you're going to have live than you would in a studio. But I'd rather talk about things like equalization, because equalization in a live arena is absolutely paramount.
Well, and especially, let me qualify that even more so by saying, when you're in a different room every night,
yes,
you're having to deal with all of that as part of the whole.
In multiple ways.
Yeah, you don't know what you're getting to a certain extent.
Like in this, when I'm, say for instance, when I'm cutting vocals in the studio, I quite often will not EQ a vocal at all. I just cut it flat.
Right.
But that is never the case in live. I mean, you love your filters.
Uh-huh.
Your high-pass filters, learn to love them. I actually don't like the way filters sound. I never have. In the studio, I don't like them. They're sometimes necessary. I'll use them later in a mix.
Right.
But in on the road, love them all the time. The other thing about EQ, one of the main differences is in the studio we tend to add a lot. We tend to you reach to add a little.
They tell you to roll it off.
Well, yeah, but it's easy. It's easy and fast. You turn up to 10K
absolutely.
on a nice soft curve, and everything. Everybody
Give
starts
it a little
smiling.
Bump here, a little bump there. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
A good friend of mine has that's a little joke he always says in the studio. Mick Kozowski.
Uh-huh.
He goes. He reaches over to the equalizer knob, the high frequency, and he goes, "Genius, asshole." Genius, asshole. You can't do that in live. Well, you can, but you
could, but
you might pay the
trouble.
price.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So the first thing you're looking for is what to cut. And it actually improved me in the studio doing live stuff because I started.
Well, I could see that.
I
Yeah.
started, instead of just reaching for the high end to give everything more presence, I started looking for what to cut to create the presence the other way. And it's a different sound.
It's a little more surgical in that sense, isn't it?
It's quite a bit more surgical, yes. And I do tend to use high cues, especially if I'm looking for problem frequencies.
Right.
And
Which
there's
goes back to the whole idea of being confronted with a new venue every night, right?
Yeah, I know. So let's talk just a little bit about, since we're talking about equalization, the EQ. When you go into a studio, the room is EQ'd. I have seen people, and I have messed with room EQs in studios, but it's really very rare. Usually the studios don't want you to touch anything. If you're going to EQ it, usually it will be a live person engineer who want to come in and EQ the room because that's what they do.
And a lot of studios used to lock up their graphics
lock it
so
up.
you wouldn't even touch the room.
Right.
Yeah.
So you can't mess with it. And they spend like $1,000 to have somebody come in and shoot the room, and they don't want you messing with it, and for a good reason. In the live situation, the PA is tuned to whatever someone thinks is flat or it sounds good, and then someone like me would come in, and now I have an EQ on the whole system. And in fact, on different parts of the system, different parts of the system will have separate EQs. And that's one of the first things I'll do is I'll go in and I'll listen to the system, and I will adjust the speakers to that's not something that you do in the studio. So you have to bring in the source that you know. Some people use noise. I can't do that. I have to listen to music,
Well, now let me back you up for a second there, because that's another question. Are we dealing with a PA system that you're bringing with you, or are you also using the house's system? There's another variable that you have to account for, right?
I have never worked on a tour that was big enough that
you brought your own system.
own and set up.
So
that would be heaven. I'll tell you, that would be heaven, because every night it's different.
And that's the problem. Is half the time you walk into these places and the system is, it's going to be a problem no matter what.
Well, I would say most of the venues that I'm working with Kenny Loggins, so most of the venues that we're playing at, their systems are pretty good.
What size rooms are you talking about here?
Well, we'll do anything from 300 to 30,000.
Okay.
Most of them, most of our shows, it's a wide range, but most of them are around 17, 1800. Like medium-sized venues.
Okay.
So, but they all have good systems, but they are all different, and they're all custom. And that's one of the things that I have to do also that's completely different. Now I have to what's called advance the show, and I have to check through all the gear and see if I have everything that we need to do our show. You don't really do that in this studio. I mean, you kind of do. You want to see what mics the studio has, but that's about it.
Yeah.
It's like usually you look at their mic selection, and that's about it. But on the road, you got speakers, monitors, consoles. That's about it. Whatever.
So do you normally go out ahead of time and advance the show like that?
No, it's all done on the phone.
Okay.
And there's venue packages. Every venue has a PDF or some kind of online thing that you look at. And you look at a list, and you make sure you got it. And we send them our requirements, and then we rent whatever they don't have and we need. We backline whatever.
But that still leaves a lot to the imagination, shall we say?
Well, and you never know what you're going to get.
Yeah.
So even if you order the same stuff, sometimes it's not in great condition.
And gear sometimes tends to be a little bit more beat up than other times.
For instance, recently we've had some shows where we've had a lot of bad direct boxes. And we have a lot of direct boxes in our show. We have a lot of acoustic guitars that we run through directs, and we have keyboards and whatever. And the amount of time you can end up spending just chasing down a ground lift on a direct box, it could be 10 minutes. It's like you don't want to spend 10 minutes on anything, really.
So is that something you would carry on your own? DIs for yourself?
I have thought about it. We try to keep it to a minimum. The thing that I carry is the vocal mics. So
Sure.
we have
Yeah.
our own vocal mics, and then you don't have to worry about somebody else singing into them every night.
And that removes one particular variable.
And that's the same. That's the same every night.
That's consistent
you know.
every night.
Yep.
Mhm.
That is
So let's
true.
talk a little bit more about what you walk into a studio, as you say, there's not a lot of prep you need to do. You walk into a live venue, and it's, venue number 10 out of a 30, 40 date tour.
Right.
What's the first thing you do?
The first thing I do is I start setting up my console. And I'll usually have a file that I have used previously on a same console in a previous event.
Okay, so you're mainly mixing digital.
Visually. It's been quite a while since I've been on an analog board.
Okay.
They're all digital now.
Makes life easier.
And just to digress for a minute, of course I love analog stuff. I mean, it's like, of course we do.
Yeah. Of course.
But in a lot of ways, live sound has eclipsed what's going on in studios.
In terms of the technological revolution?
The technology.
Yeah.
I mean, you go into studios and you see compressors and EQs that they're 50 years old.
Sure. And they're prized.
And they're great.
Yeah.
They're great, but you're typically not going to see them, in a live, unless
you're not gonna ride with
they're unreliable
toothpaste equipment in the back of a truck or anything like that, because it's just gonna.
Here's one of the things that's different. Your reliability is very important.
Sure.
I mean, it just seems obvious, but in the studio, if you have an older piece of gear, it's probably going to work fine. And if it doesn't, you usually have a tech or you have a shop.
Yep.
Take it out. You can rent another one. Call them. It's not the case in live. And so you need stuff that is reliable. The digital consoles are very reliable, and that you know what you're going to get. They do the jobs, and they're very, very fast.
And the truth of the matter is, in a live setting, you're not really going to hear the difference with a vintage piece of gear in the overall mix. To the point where, there are people who would argue that.
I would say that it just depends. To me, it's like the cassette. That what you're talking about is like the cassette.
Good analogy.
When I used to make cassettes, hated the cassettes. But every once in a while, you'd get a cassette that would just sound amazing. And live stuff is kind of like that too. I mean, you have it's good, and then every once in a while, you just have a show that's just spot on. And people will come and say, "Man, it sounded like a record out there," and I was like, "That's the best compliment I can ever get."
No doubt.
Someone says, "And it sounded like a record out front."
Yeah.
Good. That's what I'm going for.
That's what we want.
I want it to sound like what I think it's going to sound like in the studio.
Yeah. Hell yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's my holy grail.
So what are your biggest pain points?
Biggest
pain points.
Pain points.
Pain points. Yes.
For me, the biggest pain point is finding the Goldilocks volume. That is a skill that comes with experience. You want it to be loud. You want it, but not so loud that people are backing up or leaving. And you want it to have impact, but not hurt.
And of course, that's all largely genre dependent too. I mean, you're gonna mix Kenny differently than you would have mixed George Duke, for example.
Well, for sure, every genre should have a kind of a sweet spot or a preset. And I will say, if I can, I want to say this, and you've probably heard me say this before, that one of the things you do when you in sound check, you're getting a drum sound, and you have a 100,000 watt PA. And you turn up a bass drum, and it's like God speaking to you. And it's just absolutely power, and it's just amazing. Mm-hmm. And so some of the shows that I've been to have that bass drum of God, and it's impressive, but it doesn't have anything to do with them. Well, it's not that it doesn't have anything to do. It's just In hip hop and R&B and certain types of pop, yes, it should be there. But in other arenas, I don't want to hear a massive bass drum when I've got like 3 mandolins on stage. It just doesn't make any sense.
That's what I mean by genre dependent. Yeah,
it's genre dependent. And some mixers that I've hear, I don't know why they do it. I think it's the wow factor, and I get that part, but it for me it always has to musically make sense.
Well, and that that has also changed dramatically as the technology has changed. I mean, we now have the ability, even with smaller and lighter systems, to bring up,
pump it up,
those bass frequencies from hell that we never could without a huge wall of sound years ago.
Well, look, I love bass. I've always loved bass.
You're talking to a bass player here,
And me too. Yeah. And for years, people would tell me, man, I don't know what you do in the bass, but the bass is on. I have been far encompassed by what's happened in the last 10, 15 years or so.
Yeah.
I used to be the king of bass, but I'm not anymore.
Oh.
now I'm just the appropriate bass.
Okay. Now you're just the
when it needs to be big, if it's reggae or hip hop or something, it needs to be rocking.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that I think is, I mean, you're right. I've experienced that not just with bass, but with the power of the PA in general.
Yes.
I have experienced that where, literally audiences are like in pain.
And sometimes that's hard to gauge, and that's what I was talking about, experience, especially if you're far away from the PA. Now, I have a tablet that I take out and I walk around a little bit, in sound check. I can't really leave the console with Kenny. I can't leave the console because I have a lot. I'm always mixing. When there's 4 or 5 vocal blends and instrument blends and parts that need to pop out at times, and so I am.
Oh, and you guys are doing the whole Loggins and Messina set now too, right?
And we're coming up
so
to do that.
Lots of vocals, lots of harmonies.
There's a lot. Yes, actually, yes. There's a lot of orchestration in that stuff. Loggins and Messina has 2 horn players, and they play a plethora of instruments, of horn instruments.
Not to mention multiple vocal parts.
And vocal parts. Yeah. So my point is that I'll take the tablet out and I'll listen different parts of the PA. And one of the things that go back earlier about tuning the PA is you have a line array. The guys will usually tune it before I get there to try to make it balanced as much as possible as big a possible area. But sometimes I find that if I just drop like the lower boxes a couple of dB, and so that the top ones are shooting a little bit louder and they're going up higher, and the lower ones they're closer, it makes it so you're not burning faces off in the front row. You're not hurting them. I go.
The people in the expensive seats, right?
In the expensive seats, yes.
Well, and that's an irony that I have heard about a lot of venues, for example, that the expensive seats, the seats right in the front, tend to have sometimes the worst sound, and a lot of it has to do with how you're mixing.
And it's hard. That's when you say me, what are the pain points? It's really hard to gauge that, Well,
especially because your front of house location is.
And sometimes your spot in the front of house. Quite often, you're in a spot where there's a bass bump.
Right.
And so it's difficult to hear through that. You kind of have to translate in your head. As a matter of fact, that happens quite a lot, actually. That you have to translate how it sounds somewhere else and kind of get a overall thing that works.
Well, back to your point about walking the room.
Yeah, and you walk room, I went to see Peter Gabriel's show years ago at the Staples. And I think they had, but they had it dialed. It sounded great. And but I saw like 2 or 3 people walking around with tablets during the show.
No doubt.
I think there were all like multiple people actually tweaking the system or the show. I'm not sure how they accomplished that, but but
it sounds like a power struggle in the making.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that there was a hierarchy. There's a hierarchy of who does what, and 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 that goes back to your point about trusting your people. If you have a crew, Here's something that I would like to say about the transition between going. When you're coming from the studio and you're going into the live arena, don't walk in like you know everything. I'm saying do what I did, and what I still do to this day is I come in and I say, I have never worked this room before. You've worked this room before. Tell me what you hear. Show me. I will listen to it. If I agree with you, I will make adjustments. And I probably will agree with you, but I'll reserve that for later.
And that goes back to the whole idea of relationships.
Work with your people.
Yeah,
work with the people that have worked that venue, and
Sure.
and don't be what my wife Jerry has called a spore.
Oh.
And I was a spore for a long time.
Uh-huh.
And what that stands for is a studio person on remote.
Ooh, ouch.
And I don't know how many live people call us them. Hopefully I'm not that anymore. I have quite a few shows under my belt now. And
Well, you are one of the few people that has really done that transition
It's hard.
gracefully. And
It's hard.
that's one of the reasons we're having this conversation,
Yeah,
because I think there are so many. I mean, yes, there are a ton of technical points as to how you handle mixing live versus studio. A ton of them. We can't even scratch the surface of half of the stuff you need to do in terms of your outboard gear and everything else. But I think if you don't start with the attitude of learning and trust and all of those other human psychology concepts, the rest of that is useless.
It works for me as front of house. The same thing that I sometimes, I don't know if I hear it or tell artists, is like, love your crew and they will love you back.
Exactly. Yes.
If you don't give any love to your crew, and you're going to get somebody who mixes like this.
Not that we've ever seen anybody do that.
And that makes me nuts, because I can't sit while I'm working. I am working from beginning to end. I am constantly making changes because the band changes, and I'm using my ears the way I think things should sound from years of studio experience and making a lot of records. That's my bar. So I'm always adjusting things to make it as close to that as I possibly can. So when I see someone doing, and now granted, when I see somebody doing that, I usually don't like it. But there are times when it's right, and you can do that. There are times.
Yeah, and there are artists.
But for me, it's rare.
Yeah, well, and I don't want to say in their defense, because maybe that's a little too strong, but let's acknowledge the fact that there are a lot of artists that perform with a lot of tracks. And once you set it, it's not going to change because it's pre-recorded.
Right.
Whereas you have always worked with live musicians. You have a very intuitive and musical approach to those live musicians, which is why they call you.
I hope so.
I think so. Yeah,
yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
And that, I think, in that respect, when you're mixing, you're playing an instrument, man. The console is your instrument, and you are interacting with those people up on the stage absolutely as much as they are interacting with each other. Maybe in a different level, but there's that bond is indelible.
I can tell you a little story. There was one place that we played with Kenny, and Kenny has asked that we at crew, dress up a little bit. He wants to represent the Kenny Loggins experience.
Well,
right. I mean,
so the formal black T-shirts.
Yeah, exactly. The formal jeans and the black T-shirts,
Okay.
right? So show black as they call it. But so we did a sound check, and then I went back to my room and I put on my vest and I put on a really nice shirt and I come walking out, and the crew from the venue was there eating dinner or something, and they look at me and they go, "Whoa, what are you performing?"
And you clean up pretty good.
And I looked at him and I said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I am performing."
Absolutely.
That's right. I am performing.
Yeah.
And I can tell you that I get pumped up. I get adrenaline. You get the adrenaline pump I do anyway. I get pumped up, and then after the show, I wind down. It takes me a while to wind down.
Absolutely. Well, and that's to your credit, you've always been a very musical mixer
Oh, well, thank
in
you.
the studio as well as live. So, clearly, because you're a musician yourself, you get very involved in that.
I do, and and I want to, I strive for perfection. See how close I can get it. It's actually, it's in a lot of ways, it's very similar to when if somebody presents something to me to either mix or produce. They give me a demo or something, and then when I hear it, I automatically have a picture in my head of where it can go.
Uh-huh.
So for me, I'm not really searching for where to take it. What I'm searching for is how to get it there.
Uh-huh.
What's the best way to get to the picture here in my head? Sometimes I get there, sometimes I get close, sometimes I don't. It's a an ongoing journey, and every show, every record, it's different.
You have so many variables. You have
Right.
the variables of, a different venue every night, possibly a different backline to a certain extent. And then, of course, there's the human aspect.
Exactly.
Your performers are going to be in a different place every night. They're going to, nobody gets consistent performances
Well,
all the time.
how about I have forgotten now which system it is. I think it's our acoustic system that has the atmosphere adjustment in the speakers. So as the temperature changes and the
Right.
humidity changes,
Right. Yeah.
the EQ on the PA changes for outdoor, of course. But
Mhm.
I've only used it a few times, and it's actually very. Maybe
it?
it's because it was working. I was like, I couldn't really tell. I said, switch it on and off, and it's like it's very, very subtle. But this is an example of where the technology for live has. There's nothing like that in the studios.
Right. Right.
You
don't really need it either. The studio's
Well-
not going to fill with bodies the way a venue is, and change the sound.
No,
of
not
the
like
room.
that. But I used to hear stories about Steely Dan, who would have it would put X's in the room where everybody would stand,
Sure.
and make sure that the thermostat was set to
68 degrees,
exactly
damn it.
whatever
Yep. Mhm.
Of course, in the studio in particular, there's only two temperatures in the studio: either
Too cold or too hot.
too cold, or I was going to say,
Yeah.
right, Arctic
Yeah.
tundra, or a tropical paradise.
Bahamas.
Those are
Yeah,
those are the
exactly.
two. Those, and it's back and forth. But
Mhm.
we did a show a couple of weeks ago, and this was interesting. We had 60-mile-an-hour winds, gusts,
Ooh,
and we had two big
that'll sound good
video
on the mics.
monitors that were actually blown. The frames were still there, but the video screen was like ripped off the frames,
Yikes.
and
That's expensive.
that was difficult. Mixing through that, it sounded like there was a giant flanger on
Yeah.
on
no
the
kidding.
PA. Just
Well, and now there's another whole ball of wax that I don't know if we want to get into, but the whole idea of outdoor mixing versus a venue, sheds versus auditoriums. There are some venues out there that are designed so well acoustically that you hardly even need a PA. There are not many, but there are venues that no matter what PA you set up, it's going to be easy to make it sound good. And then there are places that they don't call them sheds for nothing.
Well, there are some places that I've worked that are just places that should not have shows.
Oh yeah, legendary. Baseball stadiums.
As a matter of fact, we have one coming up. I don't want to. I actually don't want to say anything bad about it because it's a show that's coming up that we're going to do. But we're going to be working on a yacht that has 8-foot ceilings, hardwood floors, glass windows on the side,
Oh,
and
yikes.
it's a box. And
Oh boy.
so in this situation, what do? You maybe turn on the vocal mics. You won't need any drums. Maybe
Right.
you might add a little bottom end on the bass drum to fill it out, and probably won't need any bass. So
Well,
it becomes true sound reinforcement at that point.
Yeah.
And,
And actually, to your point, that's another thing that you have to be ready for with every single gig is to be completely compensating for every eventuality.
yes, and in that case, you're mixing, but you're in that situation. You're mixing electronic PA with actual acoustic sound in the room. That's tough to do, and to do it well, because there's like a sweet spot for it. And if you go too far with the PA, now you have to start bringing everything up, because now you bring something up too loud, and now it's not loud enough in the room, so then you have to turn it up and in the PA, and now the mix is so.
Yeah.
You have to be willing to go in and turn it down. You have to be willing to EQ things that in a way that you would not do in the studio. Cut stuff that because it's just not working. And in particular, I don't know how we got into this, but I did want to talk one thing about when we were talking about EQing in the rooms, and this actually does tie into what you're saying. Is one of the things that I do is ring like a monitor mixer will ring out his monitors, and what that means is that you find the frequencies that ring in the room that just naturally build up on their own. If you turn the volume up, certain frequencies will start to feed back, and so you find those frequencies and you notch them out. So what does that do to the sound? In the recording studio, he's like, oh, I don't want to notch that frequency out unless it's a frequency that needs to go away just because it's ringing in a room.
Right.
It's not something you would normally do in the studio. But in a live situation, if you think about it, if that frequency is being boosted in the room and you're bringing it back to normal by putting that cut in, forget about what the EQ looks like. So use your ears and you listen to it, and it's that frequency is louder in the room, and that's why it's feeding back.
Right.
So when you bring it down in on your equalizer, you're actually flattening out your system for the room, and then allowing you to push the volume louder if you need it.
Sure.
So
sure.
That's something that you do live and that you don't do in the studio. You don't ring. Nobody ever rings out a mic in a studio. You
Well,
just don't do
theoretically,
it.
you don't need to.
You shouldn't
as you say.
need to.
Yeah.
Well, you could.
You could,
You
but
know,
theoretically, the room should be sounding.
You go to studios
should be
because you
tuned.
look for a studio that
Yeah.
sounds good.
Yeah.
That's part of what you. Otherwise, you just stay in your
Why are you-
bedroom.
yeah, exactly. Why are you in the studio at all at that point?
And use a superior drummer.
Yes, exactly. But I think that's one of many issues that you really need to be thinking about in terms of transitioning these skills is, what do I need to be ready for in terms of the unpredictability factor of being in a different room every night?
Well, I think ringing the mics in particular for monitors. It's more for monitors than front of house, but it also relates for front of house and especially for your main, like for Kenny or whoever's singing. You definitely want to do it for them.
So are you carrying with you typically a pair of like master graphics or anything like that, EQs that you're going to
No, all the digital boards have them built in now, and you can just. I will tend to daisy chain a couple, so that I'll have a graphic on a microphone and a parametric. But I will say, as one thing that one thing I did want to talk about was some of the things that you can use. Like we use compression. I use compression. Love your compressor as well.
Sure. Absolutely.
Love your filter, love your compressor. But one of the tricks that I was taught that I never thought of doing was like when I'm ringing out a microphone, and it's not fun to be around when that's happening. Put the compressor on, put it at 20 to 1 or whatever, as high as you want. Mm-hmm. And then when you ring it, it'll still ring, but the compressor will pull it back down so you don't blow somebody up or blow up the PA. But you only just got to remember that when you're done, put it back down to wherever you like to use it, which for me is somewhere between 2 and 4 usually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we have to wrap in about 5 minutes here.
Okay.
So before we do,
yes,
since so much of NAMM's audience are younger people coming into the industry, any sage advice for people who want to come in and get into live sound? or studio mixing for that matter.
Well, sage advice. The industry and the studio industry has changed quite a bit, and it's very difficult to break in. The only thing I can say for younger people trying to get in is, however you can, if you want to be an audio engineer, find some work in audio and do that, and you will meet other people who might be doing more of what you're interested in doing, even if you're not doing exactly the job that you wanted. I started as a mastering engineer. That was my first job. I was a shipping clerk and then a mastering apprentice. But you have to be willing to do that and to do whatever it takes. And I knew very quickly that even though to this day, I still master, but I don't do very much of it. It's not my favorite thing to do, but I can do it. I went from being a mastering engineer to being in the studio, so one thing led to another. So that's my advice: is if you can get work in the business, do it.
Take
and other doors
you can get, because
you'll meet. The people you meet are just as important as the job that you do.
Absolutely, yeah. Be there and be
I
ready
met
for every
you.
opportunity. Absolutely. I mean, come on.
I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. I owe everything to you, Daniel.
On that note,
You're in my will.
gosh,
You only get $1, but you're in my will.
Erik Zobler, thank you for being my guest.
Oh, my pleasure, my pleasure.
Always
Hope
a
I
pleasure,
didn't pop
man.
this. Pop, 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 pop.
Hey, I'm Daniel Keller. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join us each week for Insights in Sound.